I am JL. I am the New York Times bestselling author of The Wings of Ebony duology, which released in 2021. It was the Barnes & Noble Book of the Month for Black History Month nationwide. It was also an NAACP Image Award nominee for outstanding work for youth and teens. And A Taste of Magic is my middle grade debut. So it's my first time writing for the middle grade audience. It's the start to a series, a magic school series. In a former life, I was a wedding photographer. In a life before that, I was an educator. I am also a mom of 3 middle grade readers. So, or I guess 2, and then like a third who wants to be a middle grade reader. So, because she's trying to keep up with the older ones. So, middle grade fiction and is just really near and dear to my heart. So I'm very, very excited about A Taste of Magic, which follows Kiana, who is 12 years old, and she finds out that at the age of 12, you get to learn the family secret, which she learns very quickly, like page 2. And it's that she's a witch, and she gets to enroll in magic school right there she lives in an inner city community, right in her inner city community, in the back of her hair salon, the hair salon that she's been going to for years. She never realized there was a magic school behind a secret wall. So it follows her adventures at the magic school, her sort of learning what about her is magical and where magic is hiding in the real world. And then the world is sort of turned on its head when her school is threatened to be shut down because of redistricting and gentrification in her neighborhood. And so she has to use the skills that she's confident about to save her school or risk it being shut down. And that is book 1.
I love that. That is a nice, concise pitch. You've got it down. You know what esteemed audience needs to know. You honed on them. In fact, I've heard you talk elsewhere that you like to have almost a synopsis written before you do a draft for a story. And I'm assuming that would apply even more to a pitch, right?
Absolutely. So I like to start with, sometimes the idea will start with like something random. So the idea for this started with the smell of chocolate chip cookies baking in the oven. I was like, ooh, there's a book there, because there's a lot of food in this book. In fact, there are recipes in the back. 3 of my grandmother's top secret family recipes are in this book. So if you're into baking, it's a lot of fun. And so books for me spark for different reasons. It just kind of depends on the story or the idea. Sometimes it's an aesthetic or a song or a show I'm watching, and something will just kind of, an idea will pop in my head. But in terms of when I'm able to actually sit down and like crank out words, I generally like to have sort of a pulled back broad picture of like, what is the story I'm trying to tell? How does it start? How does it end? What's some of the fun stuff that happens in the middle, or the spooky stuff, or the magical stuff, or depending on the tone of the story. And so I like to write an abbreviated summary if I can, and that is harder than it sounds. I like to write an abbreviated summary, and then once I have that down, I can punch it out. So the first draft of this I actually wrote in 9 days.
This is terrible for our esteemed audience who's listening to a podcast. I'm making an expression you can't hear, but it's one of shock. 9 days, and obviously that's a long way from the version that gets published. There's a lot of rewriting and such in there. But what do those 9 days look like?
Oh, goodness. So if you really want to know with specificity, you can go to my YouTube channel because I documented the entire thing. It was a lot of me being very inspired and very deep in the story and just not wanting to leave. And so realistically, I can write for a certain set number of hours every day. And then I have to like plug into real life and do things like be an adult. Totally lame. Don't recommend it. But for those 9 days, I just turned off all of that. I was just like, I am not mom. I am not neighbor. I am not person who goes and does things like, changes clothes. I just let myself live in the story. And I woke up, I think about 5:30. I would look at what needs to happen in the very next chapter, because I would usually the night before, like write a summary for that chapter, just like a little paragraph. What happens? What are some of the fun things I want to make sure I get on the page, and how it ends? Because I think the end of every chapter is like this little moment of magic where you're telling the reader, you have to keep going. And so I usually will notate that in my summary. And then I will go to bed and I will literally fall asleep daydreaming or night dreaming about that summary. And then in the morning, it's like when my eyes open, it's like that summary has been playing like a movie in my head. So I just start typing, and I will type and type and type. I will stop. I will eat when necessary, lots of ice cream, and all the kinds of things that I could do to get myself through. But I won't stop until that chapter is finished. Now, because this is middle grade and I typically write young adult, a chapter for middle grade is probably half the length of like a YA chapter. So I was cranking out 2 chapters a day. So I got about 20 chapters in 9 days down. And it was, it was a lighter draft. Obviously, like you said, I had to revise, but I just stuck to that. I don't get up until those 2 chapters are finished. And then I read my summary before the night before. I wake up and I do it again. It was a bizarre 9 days. But when I finished, I was like, oh, and then I'd also go to Twitter randomly. Like social media can be the best distraction because you're like, I need to just like check out for like 5 minutes. So I'll go to social media, I'll talk about it. I've been writing for 6 hours. Oh my gosh, help. And then all my writing friends would be like, keep going. And they would like flood my comments with memes and gifs and like, you can do it. And I'm like, okay. And so then I go back to the time. I mean, it was just this whole thing. I don't know if I could ever do that again, to be honest, but it worked.
So 9 days, you're getting the draft down, and then what happens? I'm assuming you don't dive right back in and revise. You put it away for a little bit till you come back with fresh eyes, or
so because that was a little like whiplash, like because I wrote it so quickly, I actually for this one did. So the first thing that I do when I finish a draft, and if there are writers listening in the audience, I have the resources and like worksheets and templates that I use downloadable on my website, authorjl.com. So if you like some of these strategies I'm mentioning, you can download them and try them yourself. So I will open a spreadsheet and I call it a plot thread tracker. And I will immediately make a list of all the plot threads. So in one of the plot threads, it's like the development of the magic. Another one is a friendship because her and her best friend is not magical. And so she's not allowed to tell anybody. So it makes their friendship very challenging. It's really fun and sweet to watch them work through that. But I have all the different threads and I create columns in the spreadsheet for that. And then chapters along the side. And I write down everything that happens in each little spot. And then what I do is I go and I look for holes. I go and look for where the pacing is lagging, like it's too redundant, where I might have a friendship chapter where they're like struggling with Naomi finding out a secret. And maybe that happens for 3 chapters. Well, we don't really need that. So I know, oh, I can cut these 2. And we can just have 1 chapter where she's struggling with telling her friend this first secret. And then the plot can keep going. So I create this like map of my story and it helps me identify the holes. So then I fill in the holes. I know what I want to do. And I make a list of these are my revisions. And then I dive right back in and I make those revisions on this book. I don't do that for every book, but on this book I did. And that second draft revision took me probably 3 weeks. And it came out to about 54,000 words at that point. I had beefed it up quite a bit because I needed to add stuff. And then I send it to some of my friends and I say, hey, read this, tell me how bad it is. And then that's when I officially took a break for this one.
That's how you know somebody's a really great friend, if you can say that to them and still do it. That's a keeper. Hang on to that relationship. So it was very methodical. So to say, here's 9 days, and they think, oh, you must be running around like the Tasmanian devil and everything's in a whirlpool. No, it's very focused. You know what you're doing. You've got more or less your plot, your not your full synopsis, but you know more or less what's going to happen going in. So you have a plan of attack, and you have a plan of attack for your writing session when you sit down. Like, I'm going to definitely write from this point in the story to this point, or how do you keep track of that?
I do. Usually, I like to write in Google Docs because I'm terrible at remembering to save. I got burned by that once and I was like, never again. So what I do, I load a Google Doc with my summary and it's literally just right there. And I just write right under it. My process has evolved a lot. When I did this book, that is exactly how I did it. I wrote the summary in this chapter. Kiana finds out that she's a witch and she's eager to, this is the first chapter, she's eager to get home and ask her mom. Well, she doesn't find out she's a witch. I'm sorry, I'm over generalizing. In this first chapter, something weird happens at school and she's eager to get home to talk to her mom about it. That's chapter 1. So that's like my 2-sentence summary. And then I just start typing right under that. And then when I finish that chapter, I literally copy paste the next summary and do this, repeat the process all the way through to the end of the book. When I revise, it's a little different because I don't put those summaries in there. What I usually do, or what I used to do, is I would use Post-it notes, and I would just make a note or an index card of every single change I want to make in the story. And then when I finish that change, I will rip that paper in half, and it feels so good. It's like, I did it. I defeat this edit. And that's the process I used to follow. Now my process is a lot more convoluted because the book that I'm working on in the YA space is just bigger. It's just a bigger book, a bigger world, an open magic system, a lot of pages. And so my process has had to evolve, but even for the sequel to this book, the process I'm telling you is very much the process I'm following. I'm working on the synopsis now and filling in the holes there, and then I'll start writing it, and then I'll start doing that sort of revision process with my sticky notes.
Gotcha. And when you start, that will be after the book has come out, so you'll have had the chance to get some reader feedback.
I will be turning in. I mean, typically, no. Like, typically, the way that publishing wants these books to come out, they want them to come out a year at a time, or as close to a year at a time as possible, which means you're usually finishing the next book before the first one even comes out, which is interesting. And in a lot of ways, I like that because it helps protect your creative process. You know, I think of like Game of Thrones, which is obviously a different audience than this podcast, but like, I can't imagine having a show out before the last books are written, because then the show is telling the end of the story before you get to write it. And I always worry that that'll like influence my story vision, you know, because I'll get that reader feedback kind of in my head. So in this case, let's see, because I'm a little behind, this particular book, the first draft of it, I will finish it probably next month. So it will technically be after the first ones come out, but I'm planning to keep my head down. Not reading reviews. I'm going to be writing like this because I really want to focus on telling the story that I want to tell, you know? And so I need to let that be a process that I do alone with my close reading friends.
Well, this is your third book releasing into the world, so I assume you have a track record of being able to block out the world when you focus.
I try. I try.
So when you come to the second book, I mean, is there any kind of a sense of, hey, if this takes 10 days to write, I failed? Or is it okay if it
Yes, actually. You know, it's funny you say that because the process has evolved. I have been struggling with the synopsis for book 2 for probably the entire summer. It is not coming as quickly. And I think that's because there's a few reasons, right? Like, I'm trying to keep the long-term series in mind and think about where I want this book to go. There's also like the novelty of the first book with a magic school angle. You're learning about the magic school, you're learning about the magic system, you're learning about getting sorted into the kind of magic you have. And so there's just something about that that's so new and exciting. And so in the second book, I'm just being very, very picky and trying to be very intentional about how I engage readers in the same sort of thrilling experience, because now they know the magic options. Now they know that they're into magic school. So it's like a constant battle. How do I make this as interesting and as exciting when the reader is now coming in knowing a little bit of the world? And I think that's always the challenge of a series. So it's a little bit harder, but I think it's supposed to be. If I'm really, really giving it my best, I think it's supposed to be a little harder.